2022년 킹달러, 갓달러로 불렸던 달러화. 2023년 말 주요국 통화 대비 달러의 가치를 보여주는 달러 인덱스 상승세가 한풀 꺾인 가운데 달러화 가치에 큰 영향을 줄 중요한 변수들이 2024년에 집중되어 있습니다. 지난 2년간 이어진 달러화 강세는 미국의 중앙은행 기업인 연준의 긴축 정책이 만들었습니다. 달러의 미래를 두고 살펴볼 가장 큰 질문도 결국은 이 큰 흐름이 언제 그리고 어떻게 바뀌느냐 하는 점이겠습니다. 큰 흐름을 잡은 뒤에 그 사이사이에 나올 수 있는 변곡점들을 살펴보는 식으로 달러의 미래를 짐작해 보겠습니다. 미래를 살필 땐 과거의 흐름도 중요합니다. 먼저 2023년 한 해를 되돌아보겠습니다. 달러 인덱스는 2023년 초엔 연준의 긴축 정책이 완화될 것이라는 기대감에 가파르게 하락했지만 이내 이러한 기대감이 섣부른 것임이 증명되면서 곧바로 반등했습니다. 이후 3월 실리콘밸리 은행 파산으로 촉발된 미국 은행권 위기로 또 한 번의 하락 곡선을 그린 뒤에 100포인트 위에서 좁은 박스권을 형성했던 이 달러 인덱스는 지난 7월 견조한 고용 시장에 더해 인플레이션이 빠르게 잡힐지 모른다는 기대감이 더해지면서 지난해 처음으로 100포인트 아래로 떨어지게 됩니다. 이때 다우지수가 지난 2017년 이후 최장 랠리를 기록하는 등 증시 분위기도 매우 좋았습니다. 그러나 7월을 기점으로 인플레이션 압력이 확대됐고 10월에는 이스라엘 하마스 분쟁까지 발생하면서 대내외 악재 속에 3개월 만에 107포인트까지 치솟게 됩니다. 다행히 인플레이션 압력이 10월 이후 차츰 해소되면서 다시 연준의 긴축 종료 기대감이 커졌고 달러 인덱스도 연말까지 우하향 곡선을 그리게 됩니다. 이러던 중 2023년 마지막 FOMC 회의 결과가 나왔던 12월 14일 달러 인덱스는 큰 폭으로 하락하게 됩니다. 연준의 긴축 정책 종료를 시사하는 발언을 내놓으면서 2024년 3월 기준금리가 인하될 수 있다는 그런 기대감이 커졌기 때문입니다. 이렇게 달러 흐름을 통해 달러화 가치에 영향을 주는 요인을 크게 세 가지로 정리해 볼 수 있습니다. 직접적으로 영향을 주는 것은 연준의 통화 정책입니다. 연준이 기준금리를 내리거나 양적 완화를 시행해서 시중 통화량을 늘리면 달러화는 약세를 보이게 되고 반대로 금리를 올리거나 양적 긴축을 시행하게 되면 달러는 강세를 보이게 됩니다. 미국 경제 지표도 달러화 가치를 결정하는 핵심 요인으로 꼽힙니다. 연준이 소비자 물가지수와 고용지표, 소매 판매 등 주요 경제 지표를 참고해서 통화정책 기조를 결정하기 때문입니다. 보통 시장에서는 물가 상승률 둔화, 노동시장 위축, 경기지수 하락을 연준의 긴축 완화 3대 조건으로 여깁니다. 이 밖에 국제 정세와 경제 상황에 따라 변하는 유로 완화, 파운드와 위안화 같은 주요국 환율도 달러와 밀접한 관계를 형성하고 있습니다. 투자자들은 달러화 가치가 국내외 증시에 큰 영향을 주는 만큼 2024년도 달러화 움직임에 주목하고 있습니다. 월가에서는 2024년에 달러화 가치가 상저하고 움직임을 보일 것으로 내다봤습니다. 뱅크 오브 아메리카는 미국 경기 둔화로 연준이 상반기 기준금리 인하를 시작할 것이라면서 이에 따라 달러화도 상반기 약세를 보일 것이라고 말했습니다. BNP 파리바도 각국 중앙은행들이 2024년 상반기 금리 인하에 나설 것으로 보고 달러화 가치 하락을 점쳤습니다. 4월에는 유럽 중앙은행이, 5월에는 연준이, 그리고 6월에는 영국 중앙은행이 각각 25bp 인하에 나설 것이라고 설명했습니다. 다만 달러화는 미국 대선 등 대내외 불확실성 속에 하반기 들어서 다시 반등할 것으로 전망됐습니다. 프랑스 투자은행 크레디트 아그리콜에서는 달러화 가치가 연준의 기준금리 인하와 미국 경제 영착륙 기대감에 상반기 약세를 보이다가 하반기 들어서 경기 침체 우려와 미국 대선 등에 따른 불확실성 속에 다시 반등할 것이라고 분석을 했습니다. JP모건 역시 미국 대선을 달러 강세 요인으로 꼽았습니다. 현재 미국 상하원 모두 공화당이 근소한 차이로 앞서고 있어서 2024년도 대선에서 도널드 트럼프 전 대통령의 당선 가능성이 높습니다. 트럼프 대통령이 재집권하게 되면 유럽과 중국을 대상으로 고율 관세 정책을 다시 꺼내들 것으로 예상이 되는데 트럼프 정부의 관세 정책은 달러화 강세 요인으로 꼽힙니다. 달러화 가치는 경기를 반영해 움직이기도 하지만 또 한편으론 달러 그 자체가 앞으로의 경기를 예측할 수 있는 변수가 된다는 점에서도 눈여겨볼 부분입니다. 시중에 풀리는 달러가 얼마나 많아지느냐, 즉 통화량에 대한 분석을 통해서 향후 미국과 글로벌 경제를 전망할 수 있다는 그런 시각도 있습니다. 한국경제TV는 밀턴 프리드먼과 함께 미국 대표 통화론자로 꼽히는 스티브 헨키 존스 홉킨스대 응용경제학 교수와 만나 달러의 미래와 2024년 글로벌 경제 전망에 대해 이야기 나눠봤습니다.
교수님 반갑습니다. 이 달러의 흐름을 짐작할 수 있는 질문부터 먼저 드리겠습니다. 12월 FOMC 이후에 시장에서는 2024년 기준금리 인하 기대감이 높아졌습니다. 만약 교수님께서 FOMC의 위원이시라면 시장에서 바라고 있는 상반기 기준금리 인하 동의하시겠습니까?
John Greenwood and I, using the quantity theory of money, which focuses on the money supply, did predict that the inflation rate would peak out at about 9%. We said as high as 9% year over year for the headline consumer price index. It actually peaked out at 9.1%. So it did that in June of 2022. So Greenwood and I did hit the bullseye with using the quantity theory of money, paying attention to the money supply. Now, the problem is the Fed has quantitative tightening and the tremendous increase in the federal funds rate. And as a result of that, the money supply is actually contracting at a very rapid rate. It's contracting at minus 3.3% per year. Now, we haven't had that kind of contraction that high since the 1929, 1933 period. So this means what? It means that the money supply is way too tight now. It means that in 2024, we'll have a recession in the United States, and we will have inflation dropping in 2024 below 2% per year. And if they continue with this quantitative tightening and high interest rates, we'll see a deflation in 2025. So you say, what would I do right now? Back to your question, you say, what would I do if I was on the Federal Open Market Committee? I'd stop quantitative tightening immediately, and I'd either lower the federal funds rate or indicate that I was about ready to lower the federal funds rate, and try to get that money supply growing at about 6% per year. That is the rate of growth in the money supply measured by what we call M2, which is the broadest measure of money in the United States. Get that growing at about 6% per year, and that is a rate consistent with hitting an inflation target of 2%. So I'd be looking at the money supply and trying to get that money supply up to 6%. And to do that, immediately I'd stop the quantitative tightening and the reduction of the size of the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. I'd stop that immediately. And as I say, I would signal that interest rates are coming down.
현재 미국의 경제 문제를 해결하는 데 가장 중요한 것이 통화량으로 보신다. 이런 말씀이시군요.
The money supply is the only thing that counts. And for example, think of it this way. It's the fuel for the economy. It's the fuel that runs the car, the money supply. If it goes too fast, you end up with a lot of inflation. If it goes too slow, you have a lowering of inflation and a lowering of real economic activity also. Lower spending happens. So it's all a function of the money supply. Why did we have very stable inflation and high growth in the 1990s? Because the money supply was growing at about 6%. Everyone looks at all kinds of other things. They call it the financial conditions index. And the financial conditions index includes a lot of things like interest rates, swap rates, exchange rates, capital flows, all of these things. But ultimately, the thing that causes those flows to change and the interest rates to change and the swap rates to change and the yield curve to change, all those are determined by what's going on with the money supply in the prior period. In other words, you have to really be looking at what was going on with the money supply a year ago or a year and a half ago, or maybe even 2 years ago. And that will tell you what's happening to the data we see today about economic activity, about unemployment, about inflation. All of these things are indicated and caused by changes in the money supply, and those happened a long time ago because there's a big lag between changes in the money supply and changes in all these economic indicators that people look at every day.
네, 지금 미국의 통화량 추이를 보면은 7월 이후에 연속 감소세가 확인이 되는데 이 현상을 가볍게 봐서는 안 된다 이런 뜻으로도 읽히는데요.
Actually, if you look at it's been decreasing since March of 2022, and it's decreased already by 4.5%. Now, you have to go back. There are only 4 periods in U.S. history where we had negative numbers for growth in the money supply. One of those was 1948, 1949. It decreased in that period by only minus 1.4%, and we had a recession. Then we go back to 1937, 1938, it decreased in that period by minus 2.6%. We had a recession. We go, of course, to the big one, 1929 to 1933, it decreased by 38.8%, and we had the Great Depression. That's when we had the Great Depression. And then we go back to 1920, 1921, and it decreased by 9%, and we had a big, long recession then. So if you have these negative numbers in the money supply, they're always followed by a recession, or in the 1929-1933 period, a Great Depression.
그럼 말씀하신 그 상황, 그러니까 통화량이 감소한 이후에는 미국의 경제가 어김없이 침체로 들어갔던 그 사이클이 이번에도 반복될 수 있다 이렇게 보시는 건지요?
If you look at growth rates in the money supply, it's interesting. In COVID, the countries that did the best in terms of controlling the money supply and therefore controlling inflation, most of them were in Asia. Of course, you had Switzerland did a good job. But if you look at China, for example, what I call the golden growth rate, which was equivalent to this 6% rate in the United States, the golden growth rate in China is about 12% for the growth rate in M2, and that's consistent with hitting an inflation target of 3% in China. So China's done a pretty good job. They've actually the growth rate in the money supply now is about 10%, a little over 10%. That's a little below the golden growth rate, and their inflation is about zero in China. The problem is that most of the central banks ignore it. If you look at South Korea, by the way, South Korea, the golden growth rate, consistent with hitting their inflation target of 2%, it's about 7%. And at present, money supply is growing about 2.2%. It's growing much slower, actually. And the reason for that is that after COVID, there was a little increase in the money supply growth rate. It went up to about, at one point, it went up to about 13%. So it was about double the rate it should have been. And that's why you had a little inflation in South Korea. Now the inflation's falling down, and it's 3.3% and coming down because the money supply is coming down in South Korea. And by the way, if you look at South Korea, it's very interesting. From 2010 to 2019, the average rate of growth in the money supply was 6.4% for measured by M2 money supply, 6.4%. The golden growth rate was 7%. So that over that period, 2010 to 19, it was growing a little bit more slowly than the golden growth. And what happened? The inflation was averaging 1.7%, just a little below the inflation target. So it's all about the money supply. It doesn't matter if you're in China, South Korea, Indonesia, India, United States, Switzerland. It's all the same story.
최근에 이 월스트리트에서는 소비자 물가 같은 단기 월간 경제 지표에 좀 더 집중을 하고 통화량의 중요성에 대해서는 사실은 좀 간과하는 듯한 모습도 보이는데요. 왜 그렇다고 생각을 하십니까?
I think they don't know what they're talking about. That's what I think. They've never been taught proper economics. As we learned from Milton Friedman a long time ago, inflation is everywhere and at all times the result of changes in the money supply, big changes in the money supply. It's always true. And their obsession is with current data. They look at what is reported every single day in the financial markets. And they don't realize that what's reported today, it's caused by something that changed in the money supply a year ago, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. That's the problem.
답변 감사합니다. 이제 본격적으로 이 달러에 관한 얘기를 해보죠. 2024년 달러의 미래에 영향을 미칠 변수 어떤 것이 있다고 보십니까?
First, let's look at the economics before we get into the geopolitics of the thing. The economics indicate the following. Number one, today we're in December of 2023 as I'm speaking to you right now, and the dollar is very strong. And the most important price in the world is the euro-dollar exchange rate. So 1.07 is the exchange rate. That happens to be very strong. I think the fair value of the euro-dollar is about 120 to 140. The dollar's been very strong for a long time. My low range would be 120. It's been almost one. It was a year ago. Now it's about 1.07. I think the Fed will be forced, with the coming recession that I anticipate because the money supply is contracting, the Fed will be forced to stop quantitative tightening, and they'll be forced to reduce the federal funds rate. And when they do that, I think the dollar will get weaker. So that would be sometime in 2024. I don't know when, but sometime. Now that's the economics, and I think when that occurs, normally the dollar should go back towards 120, but we have to look at the geopolitical situation because the dollar is the international currency. It is a safe haven currency, and we've got at least 2 wars going on right now. We've got one in the Middle East, and we've got one in Ukraine. And as long as those wars stay with us, that gives the dollar strength. So the economics suggest that the dollar should, in 2024, get a little weaker. But the geopolitical situation looks bad. 2 big wars going on, and maybe other problems in South China Sea and things like that.
Oh,
Maybe
right.
maybe even North Korea, and all those factors are things that strengthen the dollar. So we have a tug of war going on here, and I think that's one reason, by the way, that the dollar has in fact remained extremely strong. And remember, last year everybody said, "Oh, the dollar in 2023 is going to get weak." Well, it never really got very weak. It's remained pretty strong. Well, a year ago, I thought the dollar would get a little weaker, but it has. I wasn't trading it. I didn't have a very strong conviction. I had no position in the market. But if you asked me in an interview a year ago, you say, Professor Hankey, do you think the dollar is going to get stronger or weaker? I would have told you a year ago I thought it would get a little bit weaker, and the reason for that is simply because it was so extremely strong, and had been strong for a long time, stronger than my range of 120 to 140. You see.
달러의 미래와 관련한 다른 질문들도 있습니다. 현재 아르헨티나에 특히 흥미로운 움직임이 있습니다. 하비에르 밀레이 대통령이 당선되면서 그의 공약, 그러니까 달러화를 법정화폐로 쓰자, 패설을 버리자, 이런 얘기들이 있는데 교수님께서는 달러를 통한 아르헨티나의 경제 안정 가능하다고 보십니까?
I was actually President Menem's advisor from 1989 to 1999 in Argentina, and not only that, I was president of Toronto Trust Argentina in Buenos Aires, which was a hedge fund, and that hedge fund was the best performing fund in the world in 1995. So I know a little bit about the markets in Argentina and the politics and the economy. Now, I also know something about dollarization because in 1999, I was the state counselor and advisor to President Milo Djukanovic in Montenegro, and we replaced the hyperinflating Yugoslav dinar with the German mark. So we dollarized. We replaced the local currency with a foreign currency. I also was advisor to the Minister of Economy in Ecuador in 2001 when we replaced the sucre, the local Ecuador money, with the US dollar. So I have experience with dollarization. Actually, over 100 years, on average, about every 15 years, they have a huge currency crisis where the peso just completely collapses. And the best way to rid the country of a currency crisis is to replace the currency, because if they use the dollar, there'll be no exchange rate between the peso and the dollar because the peso won't exist. So step one to stabilize the economy and kill inflation in Argentina has to be dollarization. It's desirable and it's technically feasible to do it. If you
Like
work the
Ecuador, do
numbers,
you mean?
it's feasible to dollarize in Argentina. Most people don't understand this. I've worked the numbers. I know what I'm talking about. I actually drafted a dollarization law for President Menem in 1999. He didn't have the votes to pass that, but looking at the numbers, it's feasible. They could do it. If I was a minister, I would dollarize it within 30 days.
교수님께서는 페소 대신 달러를 택하면 아르헨티나가 이 경제 문제, 물가 안정 이룰 수 있다 이렇게 보시는군요.
Absolutely, because you would stop inflation and you'd stabilize the situation. You'd stabilize the economy, and stability might not be everything, but everything is nothing without stability. You have to have it stable before you can do any reforms. And the new president, Milei, right now has no credibility. People really don't know what he's going to do. And he would gain credibility by dollarizing and stopping inflation, because they'd say, oh, look, the President Milei knows what he's doing. He stopped inflation. He said he was going to stop inflation. He stopped it. And that would give him a lot of credibility and be a big positive confidence shock for the economy.
이런 반론도 그런데 있을 수가 있겠습니다. 이론적으로 페소를 법정화폐, 이 달러로 바꾼다. 이론적으로 가능하겠지만 현재 아르헨티나 순외환 보유액이 실질적으로 마이너스에 이른다는 얘기도 있는 상황에서 달러를 실제로 바꾸는 일이 가능하지 않을 수 있다. 사실 이런 부분들이 월스트리트의 중론이긴 한데요. 이 부분은 어떻게 생각하십니까?
This is what they say on Wall Street. This is nonsense. I worked the numbers. Number one, they have enough dollar. The only thing they would have to convert and need physical dollars for are the pesos, the physical dollars that are pesos that are outstanding. They have enough dollars to do that. That's at the central banks. That's not a problem. And they also have $265 billion of US dollar notes in Argentina. Now, that's the second highest stock of US dollar notes in the world. Second only to those stock of US dollars in the United States. So the country is already de facto dollarized. You can't do anything in Argentina without US dollars.
그러니까 교수님 말씀은 아르헨티나 정부 외환 보유고 자체는 좀 부족하지만 달러가 없지만 일반 국민들이 암거래를 달러로 많이 하고 있는 현실을 고려해야 된다 이런 말씀이신 것이죠?
If you want to buy a car, you can't buy a car with pesos. If you want to buy a house, you can't buy it with pesos. If you want to buy a washing machine or a refrigerator, you need dollars. Everything is in dollars already. The idea of when we talk about dollarization, that means official dollarization. So it would be a very small step to go from de facto dollarization that they already have to official dollarization.
달러의 미래가 가져올 변화에 대해 이 스티브 헨키 교수와 함께 이야기 나눴습니다. 지금 연준이 놓치고 있는 통화량 부분에 대한 지적도 그렇고 사실은 이 월가 일반론과 다른 관점들 그리고 앞으로 세계 경제에 대한 경고까지 개인적으로도 뜻깊은 시간이었습니다. 오늘 인터뷰는 여기까지 하도록 하겠습니다. 시청해주신 여러분 감사합니다.